Hey there.
Hey there. How are you doing?
Doing great. How are you doing today, Ryan?
I am doing well. This sounds much better.
Great. Awesome. Very glad to hear that.
Yes. So, the way that this works is I just record the entire conversation and I will transcribe it in full as accurately as I can, and that will be released in issues print copy June 1st, and I will release the audio on the YouTube page later that month.
Awesome.
So let's start with something easy. What is your name and where are you located?
Sure. My name's Francine Ulla, U-L-L-A. I'm located over in Birmingham, Alabama. Not capital. Montgomery's capital. Middle of Alabama, decent part of the state. Good folks, good scene.
It's one of those cities that people think of as the capital of a state.
That's for sure.
How long have you been there?
So I've lived in Birmingham since 2007. I moved here from Carlsbad, California, and never really felt like leaving. Cost of living's pretty low. I found good friends, good scene, good community down here. And I feel like we have a pretty good thing going. It's a little oasis down here.
Nice. So, what is the name of your primary project?
Sure. So my primary project these days is called Domesticatrix. It's kind of a FM digital hardcore industrial noise hybrid that I came up with, I think during the pandemic. I came up with the name, and then I didn't really do anything with it until probably about 4 or 5 months before December of, I think, 2022, 2021, and kind of said, hey, I'm going to book myself a gig and put something together under this name and see what happens with it. And it's been a really great opportunity to implement an iterative creative process into a project, and like in that way have it be something that to me allows me to work as a project with a process and with limitations that allow it to be a fun, unique challenge, but also something genuinely I'm really proud of a lot of the time, and really happy with where it's gotten. And it's something that I would consider to be one of my special interests at this point.
That's excellent. Have you recorded anything with the project?
I have. So I've got a tape that's out on Cleaner tapes out of Pittsburgh, called Play, and then like a play symbol. I recorded that. It was my live set as of like March of 23. And it was right after I would have started the project in 22 then. But it was my live set about March 23. I recorded it live, 2 SM57s in the back of a room, the direct board feed from because I use like a mixer in like my hardware rig. And then I did like 2 passes of overdubs over it and released that. It's a decent number of songs, a lot of segues, a lot of noise tracks, but also a lot of the songs that make up a lot of today's set. I kind of put that record together because my friend Desdemona Ill, I've been friends with her for years, probably since like 2017, 2018 maybe. And I always saw that she got into noise and was doing a lot of really cool things. And I said, wow, if my friend can do this, I can do this. And so that was like a big inspiration, like her stuff with Yazret Shadim, with that first record, as far as like, here's how you can make intentional noise with a project, with almost like you definitely do get that like esoteric edge with it, as far as being very committed to the way you create something and the ritual of that, and how that ritual becomes like your daily, like the performance that is part of like the live show, but also kind of the art and the like singular visage that goes into everything. So she was like a massive inspiration there. Like my friend Zach, who lives up in Wisconsin, and he has a project called Necroviolence. And his approach to like harsh industrial death really inspired me also to kind of look at that in that similar direction. And so with like play, that was kind of my live set. Every time I did a set, I would record it and I would listen back to it. And I would say, how can I make this closer to what I want to hear? How can I make this exactly how I want it? And like essentially doing I always call it thorns, roses, buds, but like there's lots of ways you can do it. But saying, hey, what worked, what didn't, and what can I improve on? And doing that with like every set and being very like, I want to make this how I want this to sound, how I want this to be, being essentially a one woman band. And so I think with that, like you definitely get like with play, that aspect of this is a complete performance. There's some edits here and there as far as I think I cut like 2 songs that I originally had on the album. I'll be releasing those probably later on this year with a stop record I'm planning on putting out with like a stop and then like a square symbol. As kind of like almost a play on like Nine Inch Nails' Broken Then Fixed, but it's like remixes and B-sides. So that's like play. It's genuinely, I'm really proud of it. The folks at Cleaner loved it. Still love all those folks and wish them the best. And there's a second run coming out pretty soon. I think it may already be out, but love those folks. Love the VHS cleaners and tape cleaners they produce. I think it's a really clever concept for a label to incorporate a like physical production of like essentially, tape cleaners, amyl nitrates, and I think that's really cool. So really proud to be involved with them and really proud to run in the same circles as them.
How did you end up developing a relationship with them?
So I ended up developing a relationship with them just through my friendship with Desdemona, and then also eventually meeting folks like Claire and other folks who are more heavily involved these days, and all those folks there. I had really liked a lot of the previous releases they had put out, the Gay Death one, the Gentega one. They're, really releases that I admire within the genre. Of harsh power electronics and more like a dungeon synth side, which are genres I hold near and dear to my heart. So something I was really proud of and excited when I got the email saying, hey, we're interested.
Hell yeah. How old were you when you started to write your own music?
So I started writing my own music, oh gosh, probably I started writing music in like 2016 with what used to be my primary band, Matchi, a really cool 3-piece no-wave outfit. We still got a record coming out. We're no longer really a performing body, but, it's kind of like that Big Black thing where it's like you want to make records as good as you can up until the point where they're not going to be good anymore. And maintain and salvage those senses of self that you have when you put them into those kind of creative works.
And who were you performing with when you were performing as Matchi?
Sure. So that's Astrid Yami, who does lead vocals, Izzy Starnes, who does Shay does rhythm guitar in like our final incarnation. So Shay do rhythm guitar, and then I in our final like later incarnations was on bass, and play a beautiful Kramer Duke headless bass with like flat wounds on it, and kind of moved to a little bit more of like a bass, because I've always mostly written a lot of the music for that band. And was kind of like my primary like songwriting output for a long time. But our last record we're putting out, Pockets in the Garden, is going to be really good. There's about 10 songs that we had written that were being recorded when we decided to make it no longer a unit. So I think we're doing final vocal overdubs on them, and it should be out probably late summer, early fall. But there's a lot of songs on there I'm really proud of, like Don't Say Dallas Doesn't Love You, Punchbox. All the songs are kind of about this sense of longing and disillusionment with like the American dream and how that functions into functional life as like women identifying people, and kind of how that functions into what that looks like on a day-to-day life. So like a lot of the songs are about that, and a lot of the music goes into that as well. And it's genuinely some of the best stuff we've ever written as a band.
So what sort of subject matter do you like to cover with the lyrics in your more recent band?
So with Domesticatrix, it's actually really cool because it's a lot more vague. Most of the lyrics I write are either hyper-specific. So you have songs like, I don't know, Limits to Growth, which is just like me yelling about theory for like 3 minutes. Kind of doing a compare and contrast between like the Danella Meadows thinking in systems style of the view of what societal collapse once resources become scarce within like predicted models. And so it's talking about like comparing and contrasting that sort of long view vision of what resource consumption looks like compared to like, I don't know, Ted Kaczynski's views of eco-primitivism, and kind of saying like there are multiple ways to approach a problem. And that's kind of what that song's about. Whereas like other songs like Revenge Dress, I couldn't fucking tell you. Like I had a good hook. It sounded good. I had watched a Princess Diana documentary earlier in the day. It's a good song to get levels out.
Are you interested in Princess Diana?
Not really. I think she was really stylish, but I think that like she had good intentions within a horrific system she was put into, and that system just ripped her on up. And I think that that's a very relatable thing for a lot of people. And for subject matter, I'm not super interested in the royal family, but like if I was going to be interested in something about it, it would probably be like, I don't know, she was kind of cunty.
There's inherent tragedy there.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and like, and especially with how it relates to like her death and kind of how that was handled and how I think a lot of people reacted to that. But I don't think within the context of like writing for Domesticatrix, it goes any deeper than I had it listed out. And 'cause I always list out like, that would be a cool song title, or I should use that for something. Kind of like, I always think of it kind of like how when Trent Reznor was putting together the Downward Spiral, there was always a VHS or a DAT player somewhere handy, even if they were fucking around in a hotel room, to if they found a good sample on TV out in the middle of nowhere, like most of the samples on Portrait of an American Family come out that way, where it's just like you just have a big old DAT recorder of, oh, that's cool, oh, that's neat, I could use that, and then you just use them with spice. And so like that kind of approach to sound design and sampling was like something that like really I take into, and kind of like how it approaches into idea design with you have a vision of something, you want it to happen, and kind of the way that you could in a way like almost introduce like the concept of will into that.
Yes.
And with being able to like push yourself out of executive dysfunction to be able to say, I'm going to write something, doesn't matter if it sucks the first time, I can make it better and iterate on that. And you can take that approach to anything.
Yeah.
And being able to like take that into music is in like the process, kind of like what Devo did with like the process of de-evolution with, I'm not comparing myself to Devo, Jesus, no, those guys are insanely talented and know how to work with their own creative talents better than some country girl from Alabama could. But anyway,
but the way that
kind of idea within like the process of like the approaches and ideals of de-evolution and how that approached almost in like the hardcore Devo era of taking that approach to this is what the music is about and how we're going to make it to where it affects the total product.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you start with a concept and then you build from it.
Exactly. But also don't be so married to the concept where if it sucks, you keep it in anyway for conceptual integrity.
Right.
Like, I don't know, you almost have to have a balance there between like what is pure concept and what can there's a phrase I always use, like if you don't sell it, nobody will buy it. Like there's this phrase of like, if you just kind of pretend like you know what you're doing and do that effectively enough, that's indistinguishable from knowing what you're doing.
Sure. And there's an editing process with that too. And part of the editing process is looking for the concept, but part of the editing process is also just like quality control.
Exactly.
Okay. So what sort of instrumentation do you use in Domesticatrix?
So for Domesticatrix, I use mostly, so what I do is I use Reaper as a like all-in-one studio almost when I'm like building out songs. And I've got about like 20 instances of DexEd, which is like a free DX7 clone running in there, running with all custom patches I've built.
Nice.
And about 16 of those I've got just running on MIDI channels 1 through 16.
Uh-huh.
And so over the iterations of like building out that studio setup, I've included like essentially legacy project file support, to where any project files I've written since like the beginning of the project, because of the way I have essentially all of my different channels bust. So I've got like a MIDI bus, I've got a drum machine bus, I've got a sampler bus, and then I've got like 2 miscellaneous buses. And those track numbers are essentially maxed out to 32 all the time. So anything I copy paste, regardless of if I've added new stuff, can seamlessly sit on top of everything to be able to have essentially sequences that are the songs that I can hit live over those MIDI channels. But I can also go in my key step, and if I need to like back up a measure or if I need to jump to a certain point, I can. And that's been like a pretty big part of like how I interact, like the live writing process with the studio process, but also back to the live process. So I'm essentially hitting copies of my studio files live, but I'm able to have it not feel like I'm cheating, because there's a lot that can go wrong with that. I can have a MIDI note get stuck on. There's a decent amount of challenge with towing that line to the point where like beginning of every song, I send like a default command to all of my MIDI channels saying, okay, velocity 0, pitch 0, like 0 all of my params. That way, nothing gets stuck on if I'm doing like some really extreme pitch bends or like just really abusing MIDI within the context of DexEd. I then usually when I'm using DexEd, I bring it down a couple of operators and use like only a couple certain algorithms when I'm writing stuff. That way, because I really admire like the sound design that was written for like the YM2151 sound chip, which is like a similar version to what's used in like a DX7, but it's a little different. But because it sounds a little different, you can write DX7 patches that, because you're not using the full might of the DX7, you can kind of get that almost Genesis kind of sound, because it was used in a variant of it was used in the Genesis. But the YM2151, I have my primary interest in because it was used in like every Williams System 11 pinball machine. And I was a pinball tech for a decade. I actually wrote an article for Issues probably, 5 years ago now, about pinball repair. And just, pinball has been something that's really stuck with me as far as that style of like soundtrack writing, like the stuff by Brian Schmidt's incredible. Like a lot of people that really knew their shit as far as writing straight to like a YM2151 with like a really simple crunchy DAT for drums. So you have like these just crunch down drum samples, these ripping like FM leads that are made to emulate the sound of guitars, but are just crunching through like little tiny 10-inch speakers. It's something that like really, I think, it's funny because like at its core, like Domesticatrix is kind of a chiptune project in that way. Because part of the way I limit myself a lot of the time is I say, no, I'm not going to record live guitar. I'll just, write some FM stuff. Or I'm not going to, a couple songs I record in bass, just using like a Sans amp in my bass and like a big muff.
Yeah, exactly.
And then like a couple songs, like my cover of Heresy, that's me playing my Les Paul through like a Zoom 9050 distortion unit, same as used by Trent Reznor on the Downward Spiral. And so you get that sound exactly, even though I'm playing it pretty fucking sloppily. That's the TDS guitar sound. And I like doing covers with Domesticatrix because it's like, it gives people a touch point. It gives me a chance to throw in energy that doesn't come out of myself. I get to essentially play a role, play a character almost. And I mean, that's kind of a whole thing with the whole project, is there's that level of where is the theatrics and where am I just having a good time expressing myself with like music. And like, but also keeping in mind that like with that project in platforming, there's a lot of things that I feel very strongly about, and like the personal is political, especially as like a transgender individual, that like, I'll say what I feel about things, and that's gotten me in hot water in the past, but okay, I'm not apologetic for that.
Are there any songs that you noticed seem to go over well live in particular?
Sure. That's a great question. New Flesh has always been a big hit. Really, really love that song. I wrote that one about Videodrome, one of my favorite movies.
Oh, hell yes.
Love that song. It has a cool, catchy hook. Towards the end, actually, it's not on the studio version, on the cleaner tape, but I've added in this whole like, like there's a whole like outro part that I sing now. And I just released a live record called Living Hyperreal off the soundboard. And I really like the live version that ended up on there, because all the recordings on that record are just me literally off the soundboard from a show in Cincinnati that my friend Daisy from Lung put together. And Robbie from Realicide ran sound and ran the board and also played that night with his project THX 1312. And so that's that show, and then a show over at Desdemona's house over at the Demon Dungeon that Farrah Fawcett played, and a whole bunch of really great noise folks.
That's the name of a band, of course.
Yep, exactly. Farrah, F-A-U-C-E-T, Fawcett. Yep, really, really good, really good noise artist.
Farrah Fawcett just went to a jail.
No, it's not like Harry Dean Stanton showing up at punk shows back in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I can rest you assured that the actual Farrah Fawcett is not involved in the northeastern U.S. noise scene whatsoever.
Well, can you really be 100% sure?
That's very funny. But other songs that go well, the newer stuff I've been writing that's like more like digital hardcore, like Atari Teenage Riot or like Lotion inspired. Yeah. Like that stuff's been going over really well, and like it's crazy and amazing to see people like moshing and stage diving at local shows to like one person industrial. Like it's an amazing feeling. Like and seeing people writing two-step parts and like seeing people two-step when it's essentially just like arcade music is like really, really cool. Like it reminds me of reading about like folks like Inverse Phase, who also write like chiptune stuff, but a little bit more like almost kind of like that Anime Gucci core kind of stuff. Like delving into like those broader areas of like Nintendo core.
A little bit later, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. So you kind of have like those sorts of progression as far as like live instrumentation with being like actual hardware nerds when it comes to I want this to sound a certain way. It's kind of like that Brian Eno concept of like looking for the limitations and trying to like work with and paint with the limitations. And I think that's something really cool that you can do with like a modern digital DAW. Is it's so powerful compared to like what we had in the early 90s. I was born in 95, but like what was available in the early 90s.
Well, that's the thing
that like, yeah, go ahead.
With video game music and arcade music, and I guess pinball music works this way too, you have this entire expansive library of music, but that was never intended to be music in the sense that people normally think of it. It's not ambient. It's not, but it's like it's there just to provide a little extra entertainment during some other experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And like that, in that way, like it's almost the way I view a lot of noise and view a lot of experimental music, with like its ability to not be stuck to genre conventions. Like something that like I'm really excited to see in like the D-beat scene like these days is like there are so many good D-beat bands now that are going outside of my band sounds like Discharge or my band sounds like Disclose. Like there's and it's so cool to hear like, yeah, you hear that influence, but you hear people ripping like the nastiest guitar solos possible over just trebly bullshit, but like doing it in a way that's expressing things because people want to express it from the core. Like people have music and the ideas they want to express leaking out of them. And like the only way that they can express them is through doing exactly what the fuck they want, regardless of genre conventions.
Genre convention or instrument convention.
Exactly.
There's such a panoply of sounds that people just are just really bombarded with from birth at this point, that there's just this like almost an infinite well of things you can draw from.
Oh, it's like the waveform. Like if you're thinking about like modular synthesis, like every bit of sound and every bit of every waveform has like that shape, right?
Yeah.
And like if you start thinking in shapes rather than thinking in sounds, then you're getting somewhere.
Yeah, I agree.
I have an oscilloscope that I use for sometimes when I'm writing. I don't use it digitally. I use it for like modular stuff because I've worked on some film scores right now. And,
oh, nice.
I've been doing that a lot more. Yeah, I'm doing one this summer for a German film from 1919 called Different Than the Others, about the German penal code and how it relates to homosexuality. And so, like,
is it bleak? Is it as bleak as I imagined it is?
Oh, it was written during the height of the Weimar Republic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's I mean, gay blackmail and suicide are like the main plots, and it's all shot in black and white, and so. But it's a really cool film, and like it was a really cool opportunity to be approached about it by like the folks over at Sleep In Cinema in Birmingham.
Oh wow!
And
cool.
Being able to like do that in a live context, in a live setting for like Pride Month, and being able to be like, hey, here's some Berlin school bullshit. Here you go. And like we were able to do that like a really cool local club called Saturn that's owned by, or not owned, he runs it these days, Brian Teasley of Manor Astroman. He plays drums for that band.
Oh, okay.
So it's cool because like in Birmingham we have, it's if you want to reach out to like touch and go folks or like vaguely, you know, interact with like John Schmershel from Brainiac, like sometimes you just see him. So, and John Schmershel's the nicest guy. I really like his work in Enon, and I had a chance to meet him after a Brainiac show a while back, and had a really good chance to talk to him about like a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world right now. And it was really cool just hearing someone like his perspective on, you know, colossal amounts of mental, psychic torture and pain that we experience on a daily basis, living within the systems we live in.
Yeah.
Because like Hissing Sprigs of Static Couture, like I listen to that album every time I do my estrogen shot. It's a great record. I love all that 90s. Like Big Black's my favorite band of all time, and like I've got a Big Black tattoo.
Steve Albini.
And like I just all that touch and go stuff just lives in a very special place in my heart.
Okay, interesting. So we've come to a bit of a pause here. Okay.
Let's see.
Did you study music? Did you study music formally at all? No. So I've never studied music formally. My like background is in like business management, economics, political science, and like hardware repair. And you're a Maoist?
What's that again?
And you're a Maoist? Did studying that make you one, sort of?
I would say my education, interested in theory, definitely gave me a lot of really interesting ideas on the ways that political systems can run and how systems of capital aren't forever.
Right.
There's a really good Stereolab song called Ping Pong that, like, in my opinion, like really succinctly like sums up like that view of like boom bust and war and strife that make up those patterns and systems within like economic models.
Right.
And like personally, I'm a huge fan of central economic planning, and I think that with the advances we have with essentially the infinite panopticon that we live in, living as like American citizens. Like, imagine what you could do with like central banking and economic planning with having that sort of like top down view of data. Like, it's incredible thinking of like the possibilities of, you know, if those systems were used for, you know, the most efficient like way of treating mankind to solve our problems. I don't think that's anywhere within our lifetimes, unfortunately. It's something I work to fight for and to strive for and live that, you know, but I won't say I'm hopeful.
I was thinking yesterday, and I'm sure someone else has already come up with this, but I was thinking about how Marx said or described that basically one of the major crises of capitalism is that over time it forces wages down by the process of what's it called, by gathering an increasing amount of property in smaller and smaller hands, and then the only way to continue to make profit off of this on a social level would then be to continue to pay your workers less until it reaches a tipping point that they don't have enough money to keep the macro economy going, basically.
Yep. Fuel in the engine.
I was thinking about how just the massive debt that's currently accumulated in the United States right now, like if you take all the private debt of everyone and all the public debt, and how
for sure,
and how that's kind of masking that process. Like,
yes, exactly. Well, you don't see it on like a societal level because it's almost like, yes, we're successful, but everything's back paid. But it's back paid and backed into like those systems of debt and systems of what essentially is money that only exists on paper, but it's natural resources right from the land that have essentially created that process for that facade, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of like if you think about how every home in America is built out of timber, right? But why is it built out of timber? Because timber was cheap and easy to rake from the land. And kind of like you look at that with any sort of natural resource, including the process of raw human capital.
Well,
and like, go ahead.
Sorry, like specifically I think everything you just said is true, but specifically what I was trying to get at is like, why don't other than the fact that there's a law against going below the minimum wage, why aren't we seeing wages shrink like Marx said they should if left unfettered? And I realized that since the time that like the neoliberal revolution started in like 1980, there's been a corresponding increase in debt the entire time. So all of the wages, like you could basically look at all that debt as our shrunk wages pushed into the future.
Yes, exactly.
So like, where are their wages going down? Well, there's a hammer waiting to come falling that hasn't fallen yet. But like, I didn't think of the fact that there would be like this massive, as long as banks are willing to underwrite loans that will never get paid off ever, that you can have this really maybe long period of bubble.
Exactly. And like I've always kind of related that concept with like the idea that like almost like when you think of like peak oil and like you think of like those concepts of like long term you're able to see systems that drive industry no longer being able to self-support themselves.
Correct.
And so like in my head that exists kind of on that same, you know, going back to what I said earlier about limits to growth, like going back to like that same sort of curve you see as far as natural resource consumption versus population. And like in my head it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of where those correlations exist, overlaying those with like the cycles of capital.
Well, that's like the ecological problem that Marx couldn't have thought about because he didn't know that, because he wasn't aware of the extent to which the natural world would be dominated by humanity. But that's the ultimate hammer hanging over our head is when the systems that we've created to extract and make useful natural resources exceed the capacity of nature to replenish itself. Sure, that's like
100%.
that's the worst case in it. That's the really bad thing coming. but like before that, I assume there will be this massive debt bubble burst.
And I think that that's when we're going to see feudalism, honestly. Like, if I'm looking at, like, and I hate to say, like, a return to, like, but I think techno-feudalism is probably, like, the most likely direction things are going to go. Not that anyone can predict the future or where things are going to go, but based on, like, where things look at, people that have control or able to, kind of like how we see healthcare in the United States. Like, people clinging to these larger bodies in order to have basic, like, qualities of life that are considered like normal within outside of like the Western world, like semi-Western world,
especially in urban centers, especially in areas
100%.
where resource extraction is like 100%. Like there's nothing put into the system whatsoever, and it's just taken out of the area surrounded it. Not that I have anything against the city.
The soil hasn't been touched in 100 years.
Exactly. No soil has been touched. All the power generated is coming in from a power plant outside of the extent of the city limits. All the water's coming in from some mountain, 300 miles away.
That's part of why I moved from California. Like,
right.
Living out in Carlsbad, you got to see that stuff like every day.
Yeah, exactly. So that's depressing. But I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with that. I think
very much on the same page. I'm trying to think I had an earlier tangent I was going on. Oh, released records. Do you want to hear about my second record I put out?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Blossom? Sure. So I released my second record called Beyond the Empty Promise of Survival. Which was a very bleak title, with my friend Vinny, who lives up in Washington. But she was a friend of mine down here in Birmingham. She moved up to like the Washington area and makes music up there. Blessed used to be called Kosugi, Kosugi. That was kind of like a sludgy kind of hardcore band made for my good friend who passed, Kala Hansen. They did a memorial show for her, and she came on out and was like, hey, let's do like a cool band for that. And so that band was kind of put together for that and for also like Vinny's solo stuff. And we had joked around about, hey, we should do a split sometime. And eventually we got serious about it, and I had some songs I put on there that I really liked, and she did. And I play backing. I do drums and backing vocals on her half. I do all my stuff, plus she does backing vocals and like some additional synth instrumentation on my half. But it's some really cool songs. Like Fashion Shop is a song I wrote about how much I love going to Plato's Closet, because it was like one of the first places I was ever able to like try on clothes and like not have people be transphobic. When like picking out like, hey, because everyone's body's different, everyone has like a different shape and form, like how do you drape that across your flesh in a way that makes you feel good about yourself but also works? And like the only way to figure that out is to try on lots of different clothes. And like there was a time early in my transition when I was like during COVID, because I've known I was trans since I was like probably like 2009 2010, and then like just pushed it down really hard for a long time, and tried to not be trans and tried to say that like I didn't deserve like gender affirming care or to like give myself like that sort of, that's actually what like that song Threshold to Deserving off Play is about, is like that sort of idea that like there's a threshold at which you deserve gender affirming care with like how bad your dysphoria is. And like what I've kind of learned over like a lot of lived experience, a lot of like knowing people and like having a lot of really amazing people in my life who I look up to, is like if you have like needs or concerns, you should self-advocate and go for those, because people who do not have those needs or concerns don't even worry about that ever. Like it's not like you're faking it.
Yeah. I mean, there's no, if you got the impetus, then you got the impetus, and that's kind of
exactly
like the whole
like how that goes back into the concept of will and like wanting to execute on something.
Right, exactly. Like you have a desire, but then you have to execute it, and then people that are cultural conformists, I guess you'd say, like they always have all these expectations that they're coming to, and then they try to externalize and pathologize that to make everyone else succumb to it as well, because they, it's stupid. Essentially, it's not. I'm sorry, that's a dumb way. That's a really mean way to.
I think it comes down to like the idea that like there's one way to be a woman, or there's like being like cis passing, or like having people not know you're trans is the goal. When it's like, I don't want people not to know I'm trans, or I don't want to pass for like a cis person. I want to pass as a woman, and like. A woman looks like a lot of things because a woman is not a man. And like that's kind of like how I justify it in my own head, as far as like how I deal with dysphoria and how I like relate that back into art, and how I relate that back into like the way I present myself. Because I usually like wear like a nice little like latex outfit for Domesticatrix shows, because I have latex hobby, and like it's a fun, unique look. You don't get to see latex IRL a whole lot. And I like the care aspect of it, because like I have to wash it after every show, because one, it'll smell bad, two, what do you call it? The sweat on your skin will break down the rubber, and so you have to like wash it. I use Viva Clean, and then I use Viva Shine for like polish. But like it's nice to have like a project where, because I would say like for kind of being like an edgy harder project for Domesticatrix, it's fairly non-sexual, like genuinely, like it's more scary and loud and than it is like anything that I would consider to be horny for like most intents and purposes. Like if people read into it or look at it in a way that's like gives them that sort of feeling about it or whatever, I mean, it's not, but also it's fairly non-sexualized, in my opinion, as a woman that gets sexualized quite often.
I don't think it's inherently there, I don't think.
Exactly. Whereas, like, there's some projects where, like, that is the thing, and it is there. And, like, because of that, I sometimes either love it or I hate it.
If you really get down to it, if you're counting love as part of the sexual drive, almost all music that people make is at some point sexual.
Exactly. Well, and I think that like that sort of like approach to like love, desire, and how that like interacts with like a musical experience, but also like as like a transgender person, like the experience you have once you are, I don't know, it's something I see a lot in like T for T relationships, where like you often have that sort of required innate understanding for like emotional closeness, and kind of how that relates into what do you define love as in your life, and like how that becomes an action, and how that becomes not just something you feel or something you have, but something you do in a way of approaching things.
Sure.
I think exactly. And I grew up Catholic, and like
that'll do
no longer Catholic, or very closely aligned with that at all. But even though it gave me a great tool set for like innate mental understanding of ritual, and knowing Latin's handy.
As aesthetic as hell.
Oh, aesthetic as hell. Like genuinely, like there's nothing more comforting than seeing like a giant Gothic cathedral. It's like why I'm a Warhammer 40K fan. I play Sister.
Seeing sunlight come through stained glass windows.
Oh my God, yeah! Like, it's why I play Sisters of Battle whenever I, do play Warhammer stuff. Like, just seeing those aesthetics and it's something I think about a lot. It's like there's like this innate concept of aesthetics of power, and like the way that interrelates, especially in industrial music, often in ways that are, I wouldn't say great.
Isn't it fascinating that they knew that, or there was some kind of intuitive knowledge of that, even in an era before advertising, marketing, capitalism? Yes. Like there was someone who possessed this knowledge that the aesthetic construction of a building can impart through will, can impart a emotional response, an executive response.
100%. I think about that so often with the Sandia National Labs report on long-term nuclear storage. And that's something that is like a project that I hold like so dear to my heart, because it's like this think tank approach to how do you communicate a message 10,000 years into the future, using the idea that the concept of language will be lost, the concept of communication will be lost. How do you, using purely what is instinctual to people, and what makes people scared, what makes people worried, what makes people anxious, and being able to harness that and be able to write that into, this is how you do it, and say, oh, if you want to make a place where nobody wants to go, yeah, cover it as a giant black slab that heats up. Make giant spires that spit out. Put rubble. Make whistles that whistle at certain frequencies to make people inherently unsettled. And like the idea that you can pathologize and rationalize things that are, in my opinion, and like the way I see the world, as things that came down from what kept us safe on the savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And like the idea that like, why are people scared of nails on a chalkboard, right? It's, you know, some sort of ancient predator, or like there's certain things that just give people the oogie boogies, and like the ability to tap into that and use that, almost like we were talking about with Catholicism in like a pre-advertising age, in a way to put aesthetics to power that like you see in a lot of, unfortunately, fascist iconography. That
Well,
people
that's
seem
what they
to be drawn
one
to.
thing. Yeah, that's one thing they were good at. But that doesn't mean
Absolutely.
that doesn't mean it belongs to them. But it's one thing that they were good at.
No, absolutely. I would never say that it belongs to them at all, because fuck those guys.
Yeah, exactly.
And like
that's why I love the futurists. I love the Italian futurists, despite the fact that they were almost to a person terrible fascists. But like, but their aesthetic considerations were brilliant. They were absolutely
insane.
Yeah.
Well, and it comes back to like the idea that like the human brain has like default pathways that people end up using in writing to. It's like why religion works, and why like those concepts, because if you've got these tools here, it doesn't matter how you're accessing them. It doesn't matter how you're hitting them. If you can make your body or brain feel that certain way, how is that experience different than the experience that it's expecting if it's taking the same processes?
I agree completely, and the whole idea of like, and becoming aware of them can help you to transcend it as well.
Or to use it as a tool in your own life.
Or use it as a tool in your own life. But I'm thinking like of scary music, for instance, like from when you're 4 and you hear a John Carpenter soundtrack, you feel terror. But when you're
absolutely
30,
and John Carpenter was a master of that.
Yeah, but when you're 30, you could learn to appreciate those aesthetics and like for what they are. I think part of that comes from like when you're confronting, if you confront what is scary or angry and you survive it, you're stronger than you were, or you have the perception of yourself as having more of self-esteem than you had because you've overcome this thing. So when you have these aesthetics of fright or terror or anger or angst or alienation, and you confront them and then you survive it, it gives you a sense of self, if that makes sense.
100%. No, I agree wholeheartedly.
Which I think maybe one of the reasons so many of us in like the noise scene and the experimental music scene use these darker modes. You know, maybe it's about the fact we've survived something. We've overcome something. Oh,
absolutely.
You know?
And being able to confront that and own that and be able to say, hey, I have power in this.
Exactly.
Like the amount of times that people have not that I encourage it, like people have told me, hey, I smoked way too much weed before your set and I was terrified.
Exactly, yeah.
And to me, that's like the greatest like compliment, because to me it says that someone was able to step outside their sense of self, absorb the music, and then just be totally freaked the fuck out by it. And to me, that means it's working.
And then through that, when it's over, they're safe.
Exactly.
They haven't actually been harmed. So they've encountered something that scared them and overcome it through you, like this shamanic presentation of
100%.
Yeah.
No, and that's something like as a big Nine Inch Nails fan, like I always appreciated about like the self-destruct 94 era and like that touring cycle of just like burning through mic stands, burning through stuff, being scary, wrecking shit.
Yeah.
Powdering up, wearing a bunch of latex and like essentially scary stuff. But like while also like making insanely good industrial layers. Like I got into Nine Inch Nails probably about 2010, 2011 because I heard an interview on NPR with Trent Reznor talking about prepared piano and talking about his prepared piano technique that he used on like the outro to Closer or like some of the parts on Piggy, and talking about like using the prepared piano in the Tate home where they had La Pig at the time, and kind of using that approach to sound design like blew my mind. And I was like, oh, I gotta listen to this. And like first thing I listened to was like Pretty Hate Machine. I essentially listened through the discography at the time.
Sure.
And just became obsessed with it. And like when the Tension 2013 tour came around with them touring with Godspeed You Black Emperor for that arena tour on Hesitation Marks, I saw probably 7 or 8 of those dates and made friends that I still talk to this day, and really gained an appreciation for the art and the craft of what it means to be a performer and what it means to make electronic music and art without compromising yourself and without compromising your vision and the way that you want to approach things from both a systems level and like an engineering level almost.
Yeah.
Like having multi-tracks and like the ability to get like multi-tracks off Broken, like the whole EQ setup for like the Domesticatrix like DAW studio thing is based on like the EQ profiles from most of the instrumentation off Broken, just because I love that record so much. And like being able to have essentially a full 90s Pro Tools-esque digital studio but lives in your laptop is like kind of like whenever I think there's like a quote or a concept of like, if you're sitting in your bathtub drinking wine, you're living and watching Netflix, you're like living better than any medieval king could imagine.
Yeah.
And like that concept of like, if we truly are living in like what would be considered to be the heyday of consumer culture and computing power at the hands through essentially silicon becoming cheap and things that you couldn't have even dreamed of in the 90s as far as like the raw computing power that sits within stuff that like I use a laptop from like 2014 that has like 16 gigs of RAM, like an i7, and like I can run it off that. If I need to replace that laptop, it's like $100.
That's so funny to me because I was watching this sci-fi thing, and it was from the 70s, and they were talking about a time deep in the future, and like, and the computer has 842K. And I was it was supposed to be like the year 2500, you know.
Oh yeah, that and like it, but it's also interesting to see like over time how like Moore's law is slowed down, and like seeing how like that idea of maybe you can only pack silicon so dense, and maybe you can, you know, as far as like the ability of raw technical execution, that's something I have to throw my hands up and say great job, capitalism, because like being able to have the impetus to accelerate and to build as quickly as possible while consuming as many resources as possible, while advancing the ability to say, how can I make the most money off this? Which a lot of the time is by advancing very quickly. Is something that like is kind of like almost like that fascination to aesthetics of power that you see within like the raw R&D industrial might of like the industrial machine that makes up most of like the universities and almost like military research you see in the United States.
Yeah. Like
with, you know, how quickly we saw like the DARPANET roll out, like folks like Vint Cerf and like people that were like looking at those ideas of what does it mean to have a decentralized network of knowledge, and
well, the thing is,
how
like,
does that affect the way the social brain develops?
And the military in any industrial power or any major power like the USSR was, the military is always driving innovation, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Like that goes all the way back.
Oh, 100%.
because it's a race, and at the end of the day, it's this athletic performance, which has always been tied to militarism. It's they have to get the next faster thing, the next more efficient thing.
And how that ties to like the power of the state, and like how you see like how does the state control its monopoly on violence,
right?
And like how that relates back to, well, how do we develop that monopoly,
right?
And give it its not only the way it works and why it works, but how it works.
I mean, yeah, and a lot of people in America forget that the Soviet Union, there's this whole weird myth that communism can't innovate anything, even like the authoritarian forms, but like people forget the Soviet Union
just fucking outspent them and outsanctioned them.
Yeah, and they happened to have a guy in power, Gorbachev, who was a secret liberal. And so it fell apart, but like, yeah, they put a satellite,
in my opinion, like fell apart after like 50, 60, because you have people that no longer, who were, instead of, I don't know, it kind of like, the story of Thoth, like with like the ability of having knowledge be able to be written and handed down.
Yes.
But because it is not lived and is not from that lived knowledge, it does not impact the same way is when that knowledge is created. You see that almost within those communist movements of people that are they take that knowledge for granted.
It's true, and I guess they grew up without social classes in the same way. They had the professional class versus everybody else, but they didn't have like private property owners, so they literally just forgot what it was like to be ruled in that way. Yep. That's an interesting problem to try to solve.
It really is, because it's like how do you and I think you see that across the board with like kind of the way that people as like social animals interact with their environments and try to mold and change their world.
Yeah. And the creation of aesthetics lines up with institutions, with the desire to try to impart values over time through generations and everything like that.
It's all a long game.
It's all a long game, but they still put a satellite in space and a man and a woman in space before anyone else did. So
absolutely.
They could certainly
innovate. Up until like the 50s, 60s, even with Soviet computing power and the way that interacts with the way that raw natural resources were essentially fought through proxy wars throughout, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like, if the Soviet Union had the ability to have that massive raw resource consumption, like, I think it would have turned out a lot differently as far as, how things shook out.
I mean, I think so too. And also, like, I just wonder how the internet would have been if they got it first. Like,
but I think a lot of that also goes to like the foundation of the internet through like the university systems and like where the major mainframes were located in the United States and how that matched telecommunication patterns. And like, I feel like because of the way the telecommunication patterns were set up in the USSR, you didn't end up seeing those major hubs of communication connected, because you had those long distances, but also social distances between the territory in which they ruled. And
without, I think one good, I guess, one advantage of freedom of speech is people want to be heard. So there's a drive to get involved with this thing, so that you can yell at people that aren't where you live, if that makes sense.
That's a cool thing about the internet, is you can be as much of a dickhead or shit ass as you want, and like, I don't know, you can be anyone you want on the internet, and I think that's really freeing. I mean, I know a lot of trans women that figured out they were women that way.
Sure.
Like, and it's really interesting to see how like that's impacted like the average social growth as like Americans, and like how we see ourselves within like a global diaspora as far as like internet users, and kind of how you lose those sorts of mental conditioning that you get as far as like being a person and being part of your community. I think it's why a lot of people are radicalized in bad ways online.
Yeah, they're radicalized, and I think cynicism is just never been higher.
Rampant.
Yeah, it's never been
people
higher.
being able to take things at face value and trust, because you
It's
really
gone.
have those sort of zero trust things.
It's gone.
And you can't, because people are evil. People are bad. People don't want good things for you.
The internet amplifies everyone, and there are enough people that are shitheads.
Well, and it's cool because you have like that in IRL. You have like that social filtering of like, if someone's a shithead enough, they get their ass kicked in, and like
it's anonymity.
People don't platform them. But then you have the internet where people can be shitheads as much as they want, and you're equally platformed. I don't know. That's how I deal with like whenever people like comment shitty stuff about me online. It's just like, I look at your profile and you're a literal Nazi, or like I'll look at your stuff and it's just like, oh, if I knew you in real life, I wouldn't give a single fuck about what you're saying, because like I know myself, I know my worth, because you're just some dude.
You're just a loser.
Exactly. Well, it's not even losers. You're just some dudes. And people have as much, being good and nice and cool in them as they do being bad and awful. It's just a lot of those people that choose to let that be the way they function and way they interact with the world, because they found that that's either the safest way for them or like the most effective.
Well, it's a recreational form of anonymous sadism. So it's just,
agreed.
So that's what's.
But also masochism. I would say that there's levels of both inside, and kind of like that human desire for punishment and how that relates to almost like, I don't know. I've always been a big fan of the concept of you are the stories you tell yourself about yourself in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that because a lot of people in the United States and in the Western world grew up Christian, they have these stories in their head of original sin and inherent non-self-worth, like I'm bad from being born, or I have sin in me from being born, and those are inherent things that must be cleansed from me externally. And kind of that way that interacts with people's idea of, I deserve this, or like, I'm not going to advocate for myself, or I'm not going to do what's best for me because I don't deserve better than that. And how that like goes into like biblical stories of being able to tell yourself these narratives of these common archetypical stories that you hear again and again, and then influence your thinking and influence your ability to tell stories and be a storyteller, because they're all based on the same process of things that are familiar to you.
I agree with you that if there's one thing that I think has just devastated humanity psychologically, it's the celebration of martyrdom. The celebration, like the idea that suffering is noble in and of itself.
100%. 100. Like, you cannot keep people warm by setting yourself on fire.
Right.
And like, and like this idea that like there's an inherent beauty or inherently something good. Suffering exists for suffering. Like I
think just suffering exists. Period. That's like
exactly.
Like it just is here. It's just something we deal with. But like, so the idea when especially Christianity is in particular bad about this. But like when that mindset was decided by some group of magicians a long time ago to interact with everybody else, like, oh, maybe we can make them better if we just teach them that if they're suffering, that means they're great people.
Yeah. And I think that's why you see so much like large Christian families, at the poverty line, and this quiverful. Yeah. It's kind of like what I was talking about earlier about like this long view game of Christianity within humanity, where it's like if you reproduce enough, you can win.
Right. Like we got to learn as a species to separate the difference between it's good to help people, and then not feel that is something you should also be helped. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's good to help people, but you shouldn't be helped.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Well, we've solved all of humanity's problems now, so
far from it.
I'm just gonna ask.
That's the thing about material conditions is like all of that's fine and cool and dandy. It's what I believe, but like to me, it's about living in the systems you're in and being able to, I don't know, keep yourself alive, keep the ones you love alive, and like be able to put food in your mouth and not die. And I think that comes down to a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you'd like to promote?
Sure. So I've got a record that's about to come out on Open Palm Tapes out of Chicago, called BORN, all with dots, /Domesticatrix. Born is a really good like raw DB crust band locally, and I just split with them, just called Born Domesticatrix. And we did some really cool art about it. My girlfriend Evelyn's in that band. She plays drums. One of my best friends, Jasper's in that band. One of my best friends, BJ's in that band. I've known BJ since like 2016, and he was showing me about hitting poppers before going to punk shows. And they're all really good dudes and gals, and they had some songs they were working on, and I said, hey, we've got some pretty similar views on some stuff. How about we do a split? So I just split with them, and it was really cool having them open up the record with like a really noisy intro and then going into 2 songs. I engineered everything and recorded it on my Zoom R16 over our local like community art space that I help co-run. I co-run DIY Birmingham, and I'm involved with like the space Firehouse. And it's a big part of my life, and I've run sound there since 2019 and have been heavily involved in booking and everything. And it's something I hold really dear to me. And so we recorded it there, and same place Play was recorded. And it's really good. It's really lean. It's like 6 minutes aside. And it includes some really good, fun songs, some of my best engineering work to date. And like, I'm really happy with it. So that'll be out soon. Really excited about it. And then I just released a live album, Living Hyperreal, off the soundboard from this last tour I did. I've got some dates up in Ohio coming up in October, November. So I'll be touring some more around the Northeast and kind of getting out of Alabama, because it's kind of depressing down here. But we've got a really good scene and really good folks, and folks that are making good music and having a good time. Yeah, I think that's about all I really want to promote right now.
All right. Final question. Is there anything you were hoping to talk about we haven't had a chance to? And if so, go for it.
Ooh, that's a good question. I've been a big fan of Issues for a long time subscriber. Really happy for an interview with me to be featured in something that I read just about every day, to be honest. I have a stack of probably from that issue 25 or 22 to the current issue sitting in my restroom, and I've got IBS, so I use the restroom a lot. So I get to read a lot of issues, and it's how I discover a lot of really good music. And I always smile ear to ear whenever I get one in the mail, and get to see friends and people I know's interviews and album reviews, and like I just really appreciate the stuff that y'all do over at CFR and Issues, and it really is like a window into the world, and like it's something I truly appreciate that, and that's just kind of something I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. You're the first person in 84 issues that's used that opportunity to say that, so I really appreciate it. So that's the end of our interview.
Awesome.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, no, hold on. Stay on the line. Hold on.